Okay, so I'm going to approach it, and I've set these a little higher than what we were dealing with the cubes. So you're not really going to be dealing with these converging parallels that are going into vanishing points. There's not going to be a lot of angles on this. So it's going to be more about the proportions, shape of the forms on the skull, and that foreshortened center. The first thing I'm going to do, and this is to keep it from getting, it's easy for these to get too wide. They're kind of distorted in terms of proportion. But I'm going to do a square. Just like the profile was a square, if I take this, even though it's kind of turned towards me now, but if I take it from edge to edge and turn that vertically, it's almost a square. The crown again would come up a little higher, but this way I've kind of got the space it's got to take up, and then the next step is going to be putting in that vertical that would have been the corner closer to you, right? I'm going to divide it up between what I'm seeing of the facial plane and what I'm seeing of the side of the skull. So I've got a little bit more of the side, right, than I do the facial plane, and then thirds. And there's not really a hairline, but you can see that point where the skull starts to bend back. So just like with the profiles, dividing it into thirds. The bottom of the nasal cavity to the bottom of the chin, the bottom of the nasal cavity to the brow, and then the brow to that point where the skull starts to bend back. The next thing I'm going to do is, you can see on the forehead of the skull, you have these two kind of ridges that come into a V right above the nose. I'm going to look at the forehead, this plane, and look at where that V comes in and do that as my center. So I've got this foreshortened center, right? I'm seeing more of the side closest to me than I am the further side. The middle third is the important one on this. This is one that has the eyes, nose, and all that, right? So in that third, I'm going to come up about a third of the way. This is going to be the cheekbone. So the bottom of the nasal cavity actually rests on what would be the bottom of that bone for the cheek, and the eyes, the bottom of the eyes rest on the top of that line. So my eyes are falling within these two squares. This eye is going to be over a little bit. And what I'm doing with them to kind of give me, like I'm ignoring all the little kind of angles and curves and stuff like that I'm to start with, and just kind of what we did with the egg, I'm doing with shape. The only thing I'm doing that's different is that rather than do that square as a straight horizontal square, I'm tipping it slightly. But I'm not changing it, so I'm taking this shape, which is more what the eye shape is. I'm keeping the sides vertical and just letting it lean down slightly. So the bottom two corners all fall on this line, which is the top of the cheekbone. The top two corners all go up to the brow. Then I look at where the nasal cavity comes in relationship to the far eye. So I'm going to draw it right over the top. So I'm looking, the top of that is like here, comes about halfway, in my case, comes about halfway up in the eye, and it's over the top of that eye socket. And that shape is formed by taking, if the nasal cavity was facing me directly, it would be a shape similar to this, right? When I'm foreshortened the center, when I turn it, the center moves over. So what that does is take that shape, the top slides over, so one side gets straighter, the other side stretches out. So it's basically like I've taken the top of that cavity and kind of pushed it over and kept the bottom in the same place. And you'll see it's got these little like curves of bone coming out, but I'll take care of those afterwards. Next thing is find the chin in relationship with what you've drawn. So you'll see 2 points, like the front of your chin is square. If I go up from this point on this side, in my case it's actually, I'm turned pretty good. It's like here. So it's the one side of the chin is there, the other one's actually going to be out to where it kind of lines up with the cheek. So my chin would be here, which becomes important because that's where I'm going to base. Now I can deal with the center of the mouth. Goes the center, foreshortened center of the nose, pushes out for the overbite. Opening of the mouth is going to be almost about halfway. And then I kind of mark off teeth. Like I'm seeing the upper teeth are bigger or look bigger than the lower teeth. They are actually bigger, but it's also the overbite kind of makes them that way. And then the angle of the jaw, I'm going to ignore the little cutout and just look at it again as a shape, just like we did with the bottom of the angle of the cubes. And it's not going to be as steep as you think. And the front of that mandible bone is like right at the corner of the eye. So I'm doing it as just these very geometric shapes. Back of the mouth is here. And the teeth actually kind of change direction right at this corner. They kind of bend up just a little bit. So this is it. Start putting flats onto it here. Most skulls actually kind of come to a point a little bit. So this is the basic structure on it from the view I have with it, which is kind of, mine's turned probably a little bit more than what yours is. The next thing I'm going to do, and if you're light enough, you don't have to do this, but mine got pretty dark. I'm going to lighten it up and get rid of some of the lines I don't need. Any longer. Doesn't matter a whole lot because we're just going to transfer these anyway. I'll start doing like with a different colored pencil. But now I start to like pull these shapes in. Where this eye kind of angles in, bridge of the nose kind of comes back. The eye socket on this side actually curves in at the top and then kind of swings back out. And at the same time I'm doing that, I'm going to put in the thickness of that bone. Like you're seeing, this thickness of that eye socket. Cheek. This is where I'll start to pull in like these two bones on the nasal cavity that kind of nasal cavity that kind of push out, and they line up. They're kind of symmetrical. And then lining up with that corner is where this side of this bone changes, where it kind of angles in and straightens out. Cheek comes in. And I don't want to, like I'm knocking corners off stuff, but you don't want it to get too rounded. It's easy for this to get rounded to the point where you start having round eye sockets and the skull itself gets real round. And that's not what they do. It's a very angular form. So you want to retain some of that box-like quality out of this. So a lot of what I'm doing is still straight lines. I'm just kind of breaking it into smaller kind of straight lines. So I'll take the notch out of this. Sometimes it's not a bad idea to just sort of darken some of the cavities a little bit so that it doesn't kind of gives you more of a feel for what it's doing. Okay, teeth. And these are from molds, right? They're plastic. The molds were made off actual skulls, but they're not, you know, these are not real human skulls. So the teeth are not individual. You can see where they kind of hook together. But even if someone, unless the skull is missing teeth, which actually happens with most real skulls over a period of time, they start looking a little ragged. But you'll see that the teeth show up more than anything, because of that gap in between them right at the top, which would be covered by your gums. And I'm going to start with the center line, coming down, pushes out. This tooth, the one closer to me, is slightly larger. And then as that bends around the corner, this next tooth, I barely see any of it. Right? It gets really narrow. Same thing will happen with the bottom teeth. So I'm defining them more by the shape of the gap at the top, kind of that spacing. Then going through, like you don't want to go through and make teeth, right, where you outline each one. When we put the darker, add shadows on these by putting the brighter lights on them, you'll see the bottom teeth will have a tendency, at least in the front, to almost disappear because they're going to be in shadow. Because the overbite will kind of come over the top of them. So I want to map them out a little bit without getting too kind of crazy with it. The other thing I'm going to bring in is this V on the forehead, right? It's easy for that to become, people see it and see that it's like an upside down V, and it just becomes two, you know, very symmetrical upside down V's. It has the same thing that happens to the center on it that happens to the rest of the skull. So on this side, that high point of that ridge is like right here, and then this stretches out. On the other side, it's much sharper. It comes up, and this like kind of disappears on me where I barely see it. So it's not, they're not evenly spaced. It's doing the same, you know, it has the same thing happens with the center on that that's happening with the center on everything else. So this is kind of the point we want to get to tonight on these.